Good evening and welcome to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen Artisan Lecture Series and our first lecture of the season. My name is Victoria Dangle and I'm the Executive Director of the General Society. The program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, as well as the generous support of the Friends of the Artisan Lecture Series. For those of you not familiar with the organization, the General Society was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City, artisans who represented 22 different trades, including carpenters, saddlers, tailors, and silversmiths, among others. Today, our 230-year-old organization continues to serve the people of the City of New York through its educational and cultural programs, which include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, and our century-old lecture series, of which the Artisan series is a part. The space you are in tonight is the library of the General Society. This library, though little known to many, was funded by our member Andrew Carnegie in the early part of the century and was built in 1903. It was originally an open space, and he generously gave us the funds to complete the library and add 2 floors, and we are grateful to him every day for that. This is the second oldest library in New York City, and it's a membership circulating library. Our archives go back to 1785, and we also have fiction, nonfiction, New York Times bestsellers. Now that's certainly a range. And so tonight, we gather once more to pay tribute to the art of craftsmanship. The Artisan Lecture Series over the past 6 seasons has committed itself to giving voice to internationally known artisans who talk about the intricacies of their specialized crafts. The mission of the Artisan Lecture Series is to promote the work and art of skilled craftsmen to assist in ensuring that their unique knowledge is understood and carried forth for future generations. I am now delighted to introduce to you Karen Taylor, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Good evening. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you this evening Marijn Manuels. Mr. Manuels is a Metropolitan Museum of Art conservator. Will tonight discuss the conservation and installation of the sumptuous Worsham-Rockefeller Dressing Room, one of a very few intact Gilded Age New York City interiors. This opulent room is the centerpiece of the exhibition Artistic Furniture of the Gilded Age, opening at the Metropolitan Museum on December 15th. So we are so fortunate to have this sneak preview. Mr. Manuels specializes in American furniture and interiors. He received his training in Amsterdam and joined the Metropolitan Museum in 1996. He has worked on many landmark exhibitions. These include Honoré Lagniouet, cabinetmaker from Paris, Art on the Empire City, John Townsend, and Duncan Fife, who, by the way, also has connection to the General Society, as well as the 10-year renovation and reinstallation of the American wing that was completed in 2012. It is my pleasure to introduce to you now Marijn Manuels. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Karen, for a nice invitation. Can everybody hear me? I'm hearing an echo, so I'm standing over here. Same. Welcome. It's an honor to kick off the season for 2015-2016 for the lecture series. And as Karen mentioned, it's an honor to be here at a location, an institution, venerable, but Duncan Fife is one of its members, and of course as a cabinet lover, I guess. He's probably the most famous cabinet maker in the US, so a great name to have associated with you. So what I'm going to do tonight, I have to switch over to my own. I don't know how to do this. See if I can do this. Can somebody help? Oh, here we go. This looks like something. No, I need to first start my own, find my own presentation. Sorry. No, here. So while this is happening, what I'm hoping to do today is to give you an introduction and sort of a broad overview of the process and the history of the room that has been installed at the Metropolitan over the past several years. It's been a very slow-going process with many moving parts, but an absolute delight to work on. As you'll see, it's quite a jewel box of a room, so everything associated with it had the sense of quality and was very special. Before I sort of go into the introduction of the different characters related to the story, which the name Worsham may not ring a bell, Rockefeller should, and George A. Schastey, I want to make clear, if I can find the remote, that this is by no means a process that I did by myself. It's virtually impossible. So this is a long list of people that have been very closely associated with this room in terms of research, in terms of installation, treatment, different materials. Several outside companies have been involved to take part with their specialization, their trades. So a large group of people have been involved over these past several years. And so I'm basically representing all of them. Now that didn't work either. All right. So, in the cast of characters, first there is Arabella Worsham. She comes on the scene in New York in about 1870. She is the lady who commissioned the room and the building that I'm discussing today. Arabella has a very interesting story, and I can't pass up the opportunity to tell you about it. She comes from fairly humble beginnings in Richmond, and in her 20s she meets Collis Huntington in Richmond, where he there is for one of his many business deals, I'm sure. Huntington is of course a railroad magnate at that time, one of the wealthiest people in the country. He takes a liking to her, and as the story goes, some people have different theories about this, but basically the thinking is that they concocted this scheme, if you will, to get her to New York so that they can have their relationship in the city where he lives with his wife. So she arrives with her mother and other parts of her family with a husband, a presumed husband, John Worsham. Nobody really thinks they were ever really married, but it gives her sort of like this air of legitimacy. And shortly after, she gives birth to his son, Archer, and supposedly he then passes away, but it's been found in the records he actually moves back to Richmond, where he moves in with his wife. But it's all of this supposedly to bring Arabella onto the scene in a legitimate fashion. And then, of course, there is the theory that Archer is not his son, John Worsham's, but is Collis's son. But we'll never know that. This is Archer, who goes on with a very sort of successful career in his own right, and one thing that he has established is the Hispanic Society on the Upper West Side. So this family is really closely connected with New York City. So this is Arabella in her best. I'm not quite sure if she's in mourning here. This is 1905. By that time, Collis has passed away. In 1900, he passed away, and it's buried in Woodlawn in the Bronx. So for several years, we didn't even marry them yet. They got married. Sorry, I'm moving ahead of myself. The relationship, I'll step back a little. The relationship goes on for about 10, 15 years between Collis and Arabella. and then his wife passes away, unfortunately, which does give them the opportunity to marry. So in 1884, Arabella and Cornice actually become man and wife. But then in 1900 he passes away, which is where I was. And this is her in 1995, a very important, well-established lady. And then only a few years later, I'm slowly finishing the story, she actually marries the nephew of Huntington, Edward Huntington. And the press is all over this. This is a big, an important marriage. They marry in Paris, and the headlines are the Huntington fortune is being put back together. Part went to her, part went to him, and once they were married, the fortune was unified. And later on, when Henry dies, the estate that they had built in California is opened up to the public as the Huntington Library. So that sort of completes the story of Arabella and the Huntingtons. So, the building that we're talking about today, it was located right there, only 10 blocks away from here, literally straight north, on 4 West 54th Street, which was a very lonely place, relatively speaking, at the time that it was built. The building supposedly was built in 1865, and this is an early photograph from 1867, where you can see that nothing much has been developed. Another great photograph is this. So this is number 4 West 54th Street with the inner garden and the carriage house. And in the back you see farms, and it's really very much still up and coming. Midtown, which is a whole different place today, of course. So, in about 1881, Arabella, not having been married to Cornice yet, presumably with his money, she buys this building, this existing building, which was built on speculation, and goes about a big renovation both outside and inside. So here you see the same building in 2 of its versions, if you will, the original to the right, and the once she was finished with it on the left. So this all happened between about 1881 and 1884. So, to finish my cast of characters, I have to introduce George Schastey to you, the third important name in this story. We know very little about the man, George Schastey. We know quite a bit about his career and his accomplishments in his field as a decorator and a cabinet maker and a designer. So we do know he's from Prussia. He came to the US at age 10. And then we know that he was an apprentice at Pottier & Stuymes. And if you're familiar with sort of the big names in the interior decoration and furniture making, cabinet making field, Pottier & Stuymes is quite one of the leading companies at that time. So that's where he trains, but doesn't stay there forever and sets out by himself. And this is, we're very fortunate to have in the museum, it was donated to us not that long ago, is his business card with the front and the back. And you see that's his factory, so he was quite a large establishment. He must have had hundreds of people working for him. So in that sense, George probably knew his business, but he was not the man making the room. He was responsible for its creation in that sense. And this, the factory that's here on the card is on 53rd and Broadway, used to be. Later on, he expands more or less, and he builds these showrooms, these very fancy showrooms on Broadway. And this being 53rd and Broadway, it's only 2 blocks away from Arabella's home. So maybe she passed the window at some point and said, oh, this is something I would like. So we're now inside number 4 West 54th Street, after Arabella and George were done with it. And it is absolutely spectacular, the quality. We're very fortunate to have very good quality early photography. Some is taken while it was occupied by Arabella. This, I'm going to guess by the look of it, is one of the photographs that were taken as sort of as a round of documentation in 1937. As the building was about to be raised, and I'll tell you more about that. So all of this is disappeared, and some of it has survived. The mantelpiece, for instance, that you see went with the Rockefellers to Kaikat, but I haven't mentioned Rockefeller yet, so I'm jumping ahead. So this is the stairwell. This is part of the entry hall. So this is all, it doesn't get much better in terms of Gilded Age interiors, as was the custom then for these really high-end commissions, is that every room had its own style, if you will. They adopted a theme for every interior, a separate interior. And it was usually built throughout with the same woods, with the same decorative motifs. This is the dining room. Very often these were done in oak. I'm not quite sure if that goes for this one, but it certainly is possible. This is the library. This is probably done all in mahogany, because that door that you see there, we have that door in the museum. On the front of that door is the full-on design of the dressing room that I'll talk about soon. On the back it is a solid mahogany door, and it's the heaviest door you'll ever lift. And this is the bedroom, which you'll hear a little more about, completely in Moorish style, ebonized wood, very heavy. You see these sort of Islamic designs in the ceiling. And this is what used to be called the smoking room, is now probably more likely to be the reception room of the house, also done in this Moorish style, a little more refined. It's a really, and you may be familiar with this room, as you'll see soon. So, the house on the left, as it was completed by Arabella in 1884, and luck had it that in that same year, the year before, Collis's wife passes away. They get married, and she, of course, moves into his Fifth Avenue chateau, I'm sure he had. I don't know what it was, but so almost about a year after this was completed, she may have lived there for only a good amount of months. She actually sells the house, lock, stock, and barrel. And chance had it that Rockefeller, John D. Sr., had lived in New York with his family for quite a number of years, in hotels and things like that, and he decided he finally wanted sort of a family seat. And he decided that this was the right opportunity, so he buys the building and the interiors. All furniture doesn't survive, but was retained by him. He even didn't do very much to it, there's no sprucing up necessary. He was not somebody who wanted this sort of lavish style, but for some reason he was still taken by these interiors. So he raised his family here, and if I'm remembering correctly, his wife dies about 1915. In that year, the house gets shuttered. He moves upstate, and the house goes dormant for a while until he passes away in 1937. And then the property falls into his son's hands, of course, John D. Rockefeller Jr. His wife is one of the founders of MoMA. And Rockefeller owned lots of property on that block. And this house, as well as number 10, which was about 3 times the size of this building, which was his home, both of these buildings made room, were done away with to make space for the new MoMA museum. And the location of this house is what is now the sculpture garden. So you can sort of orient yourself a little bit. So, to Junior's credit, you have to imagine that all of these houses at the time, the Vanderbilt Mansion, all these very rich Gilded Age buildings, they were all demolished. People thought it was old-fashioned, over the top, new fashions came in style. Some of these buildings only survived for about 50 years and were then, because it was Fifth Avenue, had to make room for something bigger and better. So within that context, Junior does realize that this is a really special survival, if you will. And we don't quite know why he selected those 3 rooms, but 3 rooms were donated to different museums. And here you have the bulletin from the Museum of the City of New York, where they announced the opening of their room in 1938. The other room that they received at the time was the bedroom. So this is the installation of the bedroom. Much more recent, this photograph, but this is what the room looks like. And in the third room is the smoking room, or now the reception room, which is rivals our room, I have to say almost. I really like this style myself. So this is all intact, and stands in Brooklyn, has been on display for quite a number of years, since 45 or something like that. And some of this, well, I won't tell you that, I'll tell you that later. So 2 rooms are at MCNY on Fifth Avenue until they decide in 2008, around 2008, that they want to de-accession both of those rooms. They are wary of the possible scandal that will cause, because this is a time when things that's sort of cultural heritage that belongs to the city, people feel it needs to stay in the city. Why would you de-accession them? So they go through great lengths to find good homes for these rooms. And the Metropolitan was very fortunate to have space enough for one of the rooms, which is a very small dressing room. The bedroom is very large, but also quite fortuitously went to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, which is of course where Arabella is from, so there's a direct link for them. They were also in the midst of a large renovation or an expansion, so they had space for this. And as opposed to us, they reinstalled this room in 6 months, and we took about 5 years. So now we're at the room. So you know now who the people are behind the names. I think MCNY really referred to these rooms to just Rockefeller, which we felt it was inappropriate because it was not his creation, so to speak. So we have introduced the full name of the Worsham-Rockefeller Dressing Room to sort of honor both of those parts of the story. So this is an early photograph of the room, also about 1937, just before the house gets demolished. Again, we have great photography, which helped us tremendously in making decisions with the installation. How were things configured? What did the pattern on the walls look like? And so that's really, really valuable information. So now I'm jumping ahead. This is at the museum, sort of 3/4 into the installation process. And as you can see, it's pretty bare still. The great thing is that at this point, the chandelier in the center of the room is not installed yet, which gave us a great opportunity to get 4 very clean elevations without that pretty sizable chandelier in the way. So these are sort of what we would call during treatment shots of the 4 rooms, 4 walls. So this is the window wall facing east. This is what we call the vanity, which had running water, hot and cold. The door would go into the bedroom that also was part of the MCNY collection. This is the wardrobe, wall to wall, as you can tell, and this is the other long side of the room, with what we call the dressing mirror on the right, the wardrobe on the left, and then the door. If you would open that door, you would enter into the library to sort of configure, to orient yourself a little bit. So this is the room as it is slowly being completed. We're getting very close. And this gives you a little bit more of a 3D configuration to give you a sense of space. So this is a good overview photograph to see what kind of design went into this room. And it is, to say the least, very eclectic. It's in general sort of neo-Renaissance. There's a lot of arabesques. There's sort of Renaissance-inspired carving, but you can see on the frieze that it's the gilded frieze, very sort of medieval-inspired. Then you have the very romantic putti, that these were hand-painted by, presumably, we've attributed this to a gentleman named Togetti, who did a lot of this sort of high-end interior paint work in New York at the time. But then the very geometric wall treatment, and then above your head, this ceiling. So all of that, the ceiling is original, the painted frieze with the putti is original, that was done on canvas, and for that reason could be taken out of the building, the original building, and transplanted into this new interior. And here you can also see this mishmash, if you will. It's very charming, but it is also, so there's your sort of French romantic Watteau sort of floral painting next to what is sort of like an early version of arts and crafts almost. So we're in 1882 at the moment. And then these sort of medievalish looking shields that are into the borders. So they really went all out, but really created this sort of wonderful, still coherent sort of jewel box of an interior. So this is a couple of photographs just to show you some details of design elements, of craftsmanship. One thing, if I can get the laser pointer. This room is filled with references to jewelry and female toiletry and all that. It was, of course, her dressing room, and they really referred to that very many times. So you have these sort of beaded, strung through these volutes, very sort of high relief carving, very dramatic. But that's I would say sort of a typical feature of Schastey. These guirlands come back in his work all the time. But here again, change of jewelry, and you see that over and over again. This is not sideways, unfortunately. This is the door casing, and the door casing is done in this marquetry technique, this sort of grotesque, not grotesque. What's that the word for that? I forget. Maybe it's a grotesque. These very intricate patterns, and here you see, of course, hair ornaments that were used in the design. There's a lot of reference to shells as well, which I'm not entirely sure what that's about. And these are the two sides of the door casing, and both doors have a pretty identical design. So on the left, there is, of course, the mirror. This is inlaid mother of pearl, and these very modern-looking pair of scissors, a comb. We can do a little game of what you think this is, because we certainly don't know. These two elements. My favorite choice is that this is a case to hold sewing needles, and then this may be a pincushion, but it could be a mirror. Who knows? But you see here again the jewelry here, these guirlands of very sort of elegant designs. And then sort of dominating the room are these sort of this interplay of this very flat, two-dimensional marquetry inlay. Oh, sorry, wrong button. So this is all marquetry. And that juxtaposed with the relatively high relief carving and amazing quality carving throughout this room and really throughout Schastey's work, as we've been finding out. So this is sort of low relief carving applied to the door. These are children's faces that come back in the room in several instances. But if sort of these elements come back in all the pieces of furniture. All the furniture, by the way, are built-ins, the main pieces that you saw. There's a couple of small pieces that live in the room free, 2 side chairs and a dressing mirror and a dressing table. And I have not mentioned yet that the materials used throughout this room are satin wood and purple heart. So and I'm not sure if you're familiar with what these woods look like fresh, but there will be quite a statement. And it is something that we find in other examples of Schastey's work as well. And this is a detail of the wainscoting. 3 of the walls have wainscoting going around them. And here is, keep doing this. Here is this border with leaf work, but in the leaf work, very elegantly are these masks cut in, and the way they're made is just with a saw. This cut was made, and it was then filled with a yellow putty. So it's a very simple but very striking way of adding layer upon layer into these decorations, and then the wisteria at the bottom. Oh, I'm missing photographs here. There should be something on the left as well. So what I was trying to point out here is sort of the attention to detail that sort of you will find throughout the room. And on the left-hand side were other versions of this beadwork. that is always sort of incorporated in most of the designs, where nothing is left to chance. All miters are sort of balanced. Nothing is longer than the other. They really went out of their way to make things really harmonious. I'm sad that image didn't come through. But this is another example where they really, it's not what you would expect maybe a little later, or maybe even these days. You would buy this, no, I'm really sorry. You would buy this border by the yard, and you would just incorporate it into your furniture. And of course, if you look at this, that's not possible, because every mitre, they created this mask by having these two halves of this joint meat, and then very cleverly cut into it to give it sort of like a nose and a mouth, or whatever you want to see in it. But in order to make that work, to have these miters work, they had to sometimes expand or contract depending on the length they had available from corner to corner. So here, just as way of illustration of detail, 3 different solutions of how they manipulated the design to make it sort of work for this very specific location where it was used. And I really like this sort of comparison. All right. Construction. I won't dwell on this too long, but just by example, this is the dressing mirror, the cabinet that belongs to the dressing mirror. So the mirror would be between these 2 cabinets, going at least 6 foot up. And you can see the back and the front. The interiors are finished perfectly. There's no secondary wood showing. The finish is perfect. The color is perfect. The moldings are beautiful. There's nothing about this that says, oh, it's the interior, we don't care as much. So that really is the sort of the benchmark of really high-end furniture. And from the back, it doesn't tell you all that much, but one thing that really we were struck by over and over again is there is no formal joinery in these pieces. Everything is done with dowels. Every single wood joint was executed with dowels, which is very, very sort of late 19th century. There's nothing negative about that, but that's really how they built their furniture. So here you can see these couple of details of the interiors, and also look at the color. This was never exposed to light, or not much. So this must be fairly close to what the original room looked like in terms of color tonality and saturation. And this, of course, is still 140 years old. So it has darkened a little bit. Satinwood really darkens fairly easily under the influence of air and light, but this has survived really, really well. So this is a very quick illustration that these pieces were, of course, made in the factory, but were made complete and were then installed within the interior as they had designed it. So this is the outward-facing side. Oh, we'll get this at some point. Here we go. Where you could see this sort of the coping saw that went all the way down, because this would fall over the wainscoting. This is how they would resolve their joints, where the wainscoting and the furniture meet. On the other side, however, this is a side that gets almost pushed against the wall of this dressing mirror. You see that they really didn't mind as much to have it follow so closely, because of course nobody would see it. And here, this is very dramatic, where the piece was a little bit too wide for the space, and they basically took an axe to it, as far as I can tell, and lopped off this last half inch of the molding to make space and to make it fit in the location. And the other thing that's sort of typical is that they built these cabinets sort of individually and built them complete. And we see time and again that they then start cutting into them in order to add other elements to them. So this is, oh Lord, this is the left-hand side cabinet, and the mirror would live over here. And you can see that they cut this huge big rabbet out of the construction of the cabinet. because that's where the mirror would be dropped in. And they didn't mind that whatsoever. It apparently didn't compromise the structure because it survived very well. But it also gives us an opportunity to see the dowels that they used. They just cut right through them, have no purpose anymore at that point, because the piece of wood that would hold the other piece of wood together is basically functionless at this point. But it was, to me, sort of a striking way of how they approached their cabinet making. And here another fun example for the more technically nerdier people. So here they did the same. They cut out a rabbet. This is the wardrobe, the base of the wardrobe, and you can beautifully see this is the dowel, this is the saw, the circular saw cut, and they exposed perfectly half of the drilled hole that they drilled to receive the dowel. And so you can see exactly what the auger was like, the little spurs at the end. This a little better where you see the thread of the point of the bit. So I loved finding these sort of telltale signs of the kind of tools they used. Now, in stark contrast, as well as the dressing mirror piece was built, this is the vanity across the room, and it looks like this. And it's this odd sort of cobbled together. There's no attention paid with finishes, with primary woods on the interior. Structurally not super. As we were installing this, we had trouble sort of keeping it together because it's sort of structurally very unstable, even though it carries all the weight of that marble that lives on top. But also the doors. You would think, oh, it's inside, so nobody's going to look there, so why do we waste all our time and money and effort to decorate an interior that nobody sees? But these are the two doors. On the left is of the vanity, on the right is from the dressing mirror. And so it struck me as rather odd why there was such a discrepancy. The rest of the room is really built very, very well. So the vanity started to become this sort of odd man out. And another thing that we picked up on is these two pieces of furniture have similar elements, and this is a little shelf that lives on either side of the mirror. And on the vanity side, you see that the carving is applied directly onto the veneer. And it has this kind of result where the wood starts to work and starts to cup and lifts away from the veneer, or in this case, lifted the veneer with it. So you can start to see that structurally, it's not very responsible, if you will. And it leads to this kind of loss, which we didn't find many of, I have to admit, but it allowed the applied low relief carving to basically fall off, because once the glue fails, that's the end of the joint. While across the room, in the dressing mirror, very similar element, but here you see that the carving is let into a layer, this sort of 1/4 inch thick layer, which receives, you see here the line of the inlay of the carving being dropped into that thin layer, this 1/4 inch layer, and that was applied as a whole to the substrate. So basically all the carving gets locked into this recess, and even if the glue would fail, it would stay in place, and it has stayed in place because not a single piece of carving that is made in this fashion was lost. And here's another example from the wardrobe where you can actually see how deep, really through and through this layer, this top layer, the carving is let inside and locked into place that way. And here another example of one of the doors where there's this raised panel that receives the carving, and this then gets bordered with this bead molding that we see time and again. So I'm going to tell you my theory about this. Why were these pieces why is this vanity so different from the rest? And my running theory is that Schastey might have shown that piece as a design example in one of his showrooms, and was therefore made for show. There was no plan maybe to make it functional, and maybe therefore it was made in a relatively sort of secondary or less structurally sound fashion. So I would not be surprised if maybe Arabella picked that as the starting point for the dressing room. I said, oh, I want you to make the dressing room in this style. And they ended up incorporating the vanity in the room, having been made separately earlier, but then the rest of the room, once the commission was in, they made it really properly, so to speak. So that is speculation, but I'm sticking by it for the moment. So, condition. Room has remarkably well survived. One of the biggest features that you're struck with is the darkening of the lighter satin wood and the loss of color from the Purple Heart. So you see here an example of where there was a piece of furniture that overlapped this small bit of wainscoting. So where the light did not hit the wood, it survived in its sort of brilliance, and you see the grain pattern, and you get a better sense of what they were intending, while here you sort of get a loss of contrast because the background gets so dark, relatively speaking. And here another example where this strip on the right was covered by a piece of wood, and you can see the stark difference between the exposed side and the non-exposed side. So as a little exercise, I am showing you this. This is one of the pieces of inlay in the wardrobe, the dressing mirror. And with some Photoshop creativity, this is what I think it could have looked like. So you get the very intense color of freshly cut satin wood juxtaposed with Purple Heart, which is called Purple Heart for a reason. And unfortunately, it loses that bright sort of eggplant color pretty quickly, but this is what the room looked like when it was new. So quite a different sort of statement than what we see today. So that's part of the condition. The surface, much more problematic to us was the result of the disassembly of the room that happened twice over its lifetime. And of course, this was an interior that nobody ever thought it would be taken out and moved, maybe taken out and thrown out, but not moved and reinstalled. So what they did at the time is everything is fastened from the room side through the face of the element and into the woodwork behind it. So we know that these boards were actually nailed to the wall first, then the nail holes were plugged, and only then the decoration went on, the gilding and the stenciling. This is a picture rail where you see they have this clever way of hiding the nail holes. Of course, you didn't want to see them. So what this bead was sort of lifted off its substrate, and the nail was introduced, and then the bead was glued back on, and in this way you could no longer see how it was attached. And in the case of the wainscoting, it was just toe-nailed into the subfloor. So all of this doesn't lend itself to removal, safe removal. So a lot of our time went into dealing with this type of structural damage, mostly related to either the original or the second installation, with millions of nail holes, split wood, lost wood, and here's some other examples. This is the shutter pocket. So this is the structure that lives sort of where the shutters, as you close them or open them, or however you want to call it, they get folded into, and this is one of those elements that create that pocket. It was simply nailed together, and as it was torn apart in the installation, things got tied up and veneer got lost, and so this was for that element pretty typical. You see a big long split here, so difficult things to deal with for us, because of course we wanted to make it healthy, install it, and preserve it. So in terms of preservation, so this is an example of one of the elements, wainscoting, where with as many clamps as one can fit, we had to sort of pull it together structurally, fix splits, so make it sound again. But you can see at the same time how incredibly dirty the surface was. So this is a piece that was not exposed to light, as you can tell, because it's much lighter, but also not to the environment and the dust. And this is what an exposed panel looks like. And to make it even more striking, this is the marble, the vanity, and you get a sense already here how dirty this had been. And this is all sort of accumulated at the Museum of the City of New York over 60 years of installation. So this is true, honest New York grime that has accumulated. And this is an example, Linda Borsch, who is our conservator for stone and metal, who works with the American wing as well. So she cleaned most of the vanity marble, but left this sort of didactic square of, look, this is what we were dealing with. And it was only removed about a week ago. So as we are getting closer, of course, that couldn't survive. And I'll show you a little later what it looks like now. But just to give you an impression of the layer of dirt on all the surfaces, including the woodwork. But the woodwork is structurally not very sound, but the finish was actually very sound. So on the right, you see a photograph taken under UV light, which brings out the different properties of different materials. So you can see here this sort of milky, the surround over here, this sort of milky layer is the varnish fluorescing under the UV light. But what you see also is that it's very complete. There's no losses, because if there was a loss, it would look completely different, the surface. And what also strikes you immediately is that there is no similar varnish on the carving. So they very meticulously picked out a different finish for the carving, which was more appropriate to bring the carving to life, which is not the same as what you would do for marquetry. But given the fact that the finish was so healthy, we were actually able to devise a water-based cleaning solution, which was of course tested, and Tina, who did much of that work with me, very tedious, because you have to imagine every single square inch of this room we had to clean with swabs, and it was slow going. But working with this software, she devised a solution which was pH balanced at a number that was safe for the finish, and then added what we call chelating agents, which help pick up the dirt. And that was quite effective, as you can see here, if I can make this work. So this is Tina filming herself in this stop motion fashion. This is how fast we work. So you can start seeing the striking difference. It's from something dull and without any saturation of color, without any contrast to this. And once that film is lifted, so that really transformed the room. Only that part of the treatment really transformed the room in itself. I don't know, did it stop? It should be enough. Oh. She's hesitating. All right. So in terms of the structural damage, some of it was very straightforward. So this is a sort of very old school, if you will, inlay replacement of lost veneer with the same wood, also in wood veneer executed. So where you saw the losses before, you now see the still unfinished and untoned, but still completed veneer layer where the big losses were. Here another example on the left with veneer lost before and after treatment, and that piece of lost carving before and after it was completed. So these are very standard sort of furniture conservation practices. But there were a lot of lost elements that were applied. A lot of these elements were applied to the substrate. And of course, once it's applied just with a layer of glue, it gets lost easily. So these diamonds sort of bordered all of the furniture along the room, from the room, and as I said before, these this bead molding similarly. So in terms of, we had to reproduce quite a number of these elements, and a much faster and straightforward, if you will, way is to cast them rather than to carve them or to turn them. With the added benefit that you don't have to try to capture the hand of the maker when you turn when you turn something. You have to sort of mimic the hand of the maker. When you cast it, it's automatic. It's there. You're copying his work. And another benefit is that it's much easier for a next generation to determine what is original and what was a modern element. So we like to build that in, if you will. And here are some other examples of cast elements where one piece of furniture did retain these finials, the other piece had lost both. So Tina cast from an original 2 new positives, and those were mounted. And you can see sort of very meticulously. It's not that we sort of would lop off and make this a smooth surface and then put something on top. We do not remove any original material. So if how uneven a break surface is, that's what we work with. So, installation. This is this is the space where the dressing room was installed at the Museum of the City of New York, right after it was removed. The museum hired the company called Traditional Line to do the removal, if you will, which is something they specialize in, historic interiors. And once they had finished, this is what they were left with, what the museum was left with. And the reason why I'm showing you this is the way they approached the installation at the time also forced them to nail through the surface into the substrate, because there was no access from the back. Which added tremendously to the damage in the second round of installation and deinstallation. So we went out of our way to come up with techniques and methods to prevent that same type of damage happening. So this is Joe White from Traditional Line. I'm calling this sort of the thinking image. There's this. To go back, we hired Traditional Line also to help us install the room because they were very familiar with it structurally. Joe White and Jeff Ackerman were on site for an X amount of months, I forget how long exactly. And the way the installation took place was not with solid walls, but with this open grid of wooden posts that could be placed wherever the structure needed it or wherever an element needed to be attached. So it's very flexible, but it also means you have to release, a lot of thinking goes in sort of trying to catch problems as the installation sort of unfolds. And having done this many times, both Joe and Jeff were excellent at this, and we were very grateful to have them, and I learned a lot from them. But this was a daily routine of trying to come up with what's the next step, and is it going to impede something else that we want to do later. And the first thing, this may be counterintuitive, but we started with the ceiling rather than with the floor. So we installed the ceiling first and then worked our way down. And this is an image of the deinstallation of the ceiling canvas at MCNY, at the museum. And this is clearly something that we did not want to repeat in terms of installing it and maybe future deinstalling it. So we felt strongly that we had to come up with a different system. So we hired TKM Studio. They actually specialize in paper, but this is canvas. But why we chose them is that they specialize in large surfaces, wallpapers. And they really knew their business in terms of how do you mount these large surfaces in a responsible way. So this is a couple of photographs of their process. This is removing some of the backing from the canvas, not original. This is a photograph of the lighter parts are patches where they had to even out because of these layers of paper that were behind it. Sometimes there was a loss, and if you would glue it to a surface with the loss in place, you see these sort of dips, so they had to fill those in. Then it was lined with a layer of Japanese paper. And these are the panels of the ceiling, and you can get a sense of how large they are. Fortunately, our predecessors had cut the ceiling in half already when it was deinstalled from the original house. So rather than having to deal with a ceiling of what is it, 10 by 12, what was it? 18, 12 by 18, that's true. Rather than have to deal with that, we had to actually deal with 2 pieces of 12 by 9, which is sizable enough. And they used a system with reversible heat what's the word for that? I don't know. activated. That's the word I'm looking for. Activated glue. So it gets rolled on, and then once the canvas is put in place, then with the irons they activate the glue, and that's how it's been, is mounted. And that is something that can be reversed safely. So we now have a system where even if somebody wants to deinstall the ceiling, that could be done safely. But even if somebody decided we do not want to live with this honeycomb, which I haven't mentioned, this is aluminum honeycomb, it can still be removed. So we're always building in these systems to undo something safely. So this is one of the two halves. You see one half is already up on the ceiling, and this is the second half ready to be hoisted up. And this is going up in the air, and this is where you get a sense. This is Joe and Jeff securing the ceiling to the ceiling. And because we had no access from the back in this case only, we had to devise a way to hide the screws along the seam. So what we did is we offset the seam of the honeycomb with the seam of the canvas. And in that way, with the canvas partially loose still, they were able to screw it in place. And then the people from TKM Studio came in to close it up. Again, sort of heat activated, and then closed up the ceiling, and then made that row of attachment screws disappear. This is them admiring their work. So I'll speed up a little bit because I think I'm going way over time. So this is one of the, this is a fragment of the original Cornice molding from the room, done in plaster, very heavily decorated, very nicely done, but for the reason that it was plastered into the room, could not be taken with the room when it was moved to the museum in the city of New York. So the museum at that time made a copy out of wood, and they did a very, very nice job. The dimensions, proportions, colors, the decoration is all quite well done. So we happily retained it. But because it's not original, it gave us an option, an opportunity to sort of penetrate into the room because of things like sprinklers, which we have to install, unfortunately. So rather than having to drill through an original piece of the frieze, the canvas, what have you, we designed it in a way that the sprinklers would go through the not original element. And then in terms of strategy, how do you mount these things? So these are a couple of examples of the kind of damage that we dealt with. So this is this sort of very easily, it's not very structurally sound, a piece of molding, bead molding, gilded bead molding, which broke. And you see in the past they made sort of copies of the beads very, very, very poorly. Here several pieces of evidence that they nailed through the molding again and again. And here you see one of those nail holes where something was reattached through the face. And all of that we were trying to avoid. So some things were very low tech, but very flexible and very effective. Others were a little more engineered. So here you see just simple glue blocks made out of tulip poplar with sort of appropriate dimensions, which can be glued with a reversible glue in a place that is safe and doesn't obscure original writing or anything like that. So a very flexible system, and can be undone without any trace if one decides to do that. And the other way are these tabs that we made out of carbon fiber. Carbon fiber embedded in epoxy, and it's a very stiff material, very thin, very strong. And those we glued to the back of that bead molding so that we didn't have to nail through the bead molding in order to attach it. So those tabs are applied with B72, is a very sort of conservation-approved modern resin, and then the actual attachment to the substrate happens through the tab, and it just gets nailed in place. So you get something that's invisible and still safe and effective. So here you see Joe nailing these tabs to the honeycomb. And so rather than in the past, those type of moldings would go in last to cover all of the seams, we installed them before the frieze even was installed. And here a quick example of what the attachment looks like with those glue blocks. Just simple piece of angle iron, but again, it looks awfully low tech, but it is awfully effective and very safe. So, yeah, I guess I'm skipping a lot of the installation, but I'm going to the stenciling now, also for the sake of time. So we know that the original stenciling, the wall treatment, was done directly onto the wall. And we know that for sure because on the woodwork we see actually the traces of the original stenciling going up, where you see these little rosettes still coming back. So originally this was stenciled, the room was installed, and then the stencilers came in, or the decorators, and the pattern was applied. Of course, that could not be taken with them by MCNY. So in the 30s, they copied a pretty true version of the design onto canvas, and that was then mounted into the room. And for several reasons, we decided not to use that material. We thought the colors were not quite as they should be. We felt the pattern was not quite exactly as we saw it in the original photographs. But also, when you apply something on a canvas onto a wall, it looks like wallpaper. It doesn't look like stenciling as it should. So we selected Boyd Reith Studio to recreate this stenciling pattern for us. And they made us an endless amount of samples, and we were very picky, but oh, this needs to move a little bit to the left, and this circle is a little too small. But we arrived at something that everybody was happy with, and they were able to create it in a way that had some life to it. There was a little abrasion to make it not too perfect. Some registrations were a little offset just to give it that not so mechanical feel. So here you see the pattern being laid out using the laser lines, as you can tell. So it starts with this underlayer of a very faint, a little bit lighter green base pattern, but then it gets quickly much more dramatic. So this is done in palladium leaf, and slowly you can see the pattern filling in. So the next phase is to apply the gold leaf to really fill in the pattern, and this was really a fun process to watch for us as well. As with the ceiling and the friezes, some of it is stenciled, some of it is hand painted, and the border at the bottom, just above the wainscoting, was partially stenciled and partially painted. And Jim Boyd painted these gorgeous peacock feathers. And there too, he made several versions, and we looked at the original photography, and we wanted to capture the hand of the person that did it originally, and he was very successful. So this is not a great photograph, it doesn't really do it justice, but I took it the other day. By now the light level in the room is very, very low, so it's really difficult to take a decent shot. But this tells you what it feels like. So, I'm almost there. Finishing touches, quotation marks, because they're just the last elements that go into the room, but it's not to say that they were just easily taken off a shelf and put in place. So many people were involved in these last elements that really complete the interior and make it into a home, if you will. So the lighting fixtures went up several months ago, which really was a big step forward for us. Hanging that chandelier, certainly not easy. A lot of time was spent treating these pieces. Linda Borsch cleaned them, made the brass sort of look reflective again, which it had lost over time. And then we spent also an inordinate amount of time finding the right bulbs for these. So every detail gets fussed over, and it's a wonderful process. And then the window treatment, something that Nancy Britton worked on very closely, but was executed. Nancy is our upholstery conservator. But the execution was done by a private company, Clarissa de Muzio, we hired. She did other jobs in the museum, and she executed this too. And the patterns were also investigated in terms of what material was the original, based on remnants of fabric that we were able to find. What were the original colors? What was the repeat of the design? What was the design itself? So all these things get discussed quite extensively before a decision is made. But as you can tell, it is very successful for that reason. And just on a side note, this hardware does not belong to this room. The hardware did not survive with the room, but fortune had it that in the installation in Virginia of the bedroom, they ended up not installing one of their windows, which means they had one set of hardware left over, which they kindly lent to us. So we installed it with great success, and this really finished the room off as far as I'm concerned. It really made it complete, even though we're not quite there yet. Let's see. Oh, just to show you what the vanity looks like these days. So only a week ago or 2 weeks ago, Linda Borsch went into the room. This is, of course, it had to be done on site, more or less. It's not that we could take this to her to work on in the department. So she treated both the marble and the gorgeous faucets, who are, by the way, I never mentioned this, all the hardware in the whole room is silvered. It's not gilded as you think you would expect. So it's something, again, where they really went into different materials sort of corresponding with each other. Like the silver really sort of talks to the mother of pearl in the woodwork, and it's quite special that way. So this is the marble finished, cleaned. That didactic patch is gone. Linda spent a lot of time filling the crack the marble had broken over time, which it often does. And the silver was cleaned, and this is the original silvering still in place, and it's quite gorgeous. So, I'm at the end, so I thank you. Thank you for your patience. I'm not sure if did I go very long? Also in good tradition, I forgot my business card, so if you want to reach me, here's my email. And I do want to conclude with a plug for the show, not to be missed. So the installation of the dressing room is sort of an event in itself, but it triggered the exhibition that is put together by Nani Frelinghuysen, Nick Vincent, and Maura Gallagher, who are here in the audience. About George Schastey, sort of putting him on the map as a maker. It is unclear to us why somebody working on that level sort of got lost to time. While the Herder brothers are sort of being celebrated, Mr. Schastey was maybe one tier below, but not too far. So we really are happy to sort of give him the space to sort of become reacquainted with. And then Nani has taken the opportunity sort of to juxtapose what was happening in the room and with competitors, if you will, like Schastey. She took the opportunity to install one gallery with all the elements that we have from the original Herder Commission for William H. Vanderbilt. So this was the ultimate palace on Fifth Avenue. Quite a number of pieces of furniture and the interior survived, and we have a very amazing amount of them. So that will be sort of as part of this three-lobed installation / exhibition and opening of the room. So the opening is on December 15, and I hope you will all come to see it. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much.
Welcome.
We will just take a couple of questions because I think Marijn will, I'm sure, answer your questions informally during the reception. So if there's a couple of pressing questions, we'd be delighted to take them. Any questions? Okay.
I don't know how pressing the question is, but now I fully understand why it took 5 years to install this mat. But I'm wondering, at the museum in Virginia, was the room in better condition?
No, I doubt it. I'm not that intimately familiar with its condition, but there's no reason to think that they had different problems to work with. In their case, it was really sort of an all-hands-on-deck situation. They brought people in from the outside to they actually treated their wallpaper and their ceiling on site, so it was quite a feat, and it's come out very successfully. But I wouldn't want to repeat that. That's yeah.
I was wondering, in these mansions, how were they heated? Did they have steam or hot water, and did you have to incorporate that into this?
I'm not that familiar, to be honest, but we do find interesting sort of bits. I'm not sure if you noticed, underneath the windows is a little grate which had louvers. So there was, but I'm guessing a forced air type of heating. How that was generated, I'm not sure. And one of the pieces that has come to the museum for the exhibition is an enormous hall cabinet, which was briefly in one of the photographs. But it also incorporates louvers and even some tin pans. Then people were speculating, was that for condensation water? Some people said, oh, it's for humidification. When it's really dry, that the water would evaporate under the influence of the hot air. So it looks pretty sophisticated, but I can't say that I know how the air pressure was created. But it was not what we know now with either steam or hot water.
Congratulations, it looks spectacular, and I look forward to seeing it, and you did a great job.
Thank
and
you.
I'm just curious how much all this cost.
Well, the good news is that a part of their approach for the deaccessioning is that Museum of the City of New York donated the room to us. As for the cost of the installation, hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's as far as I'll go.
We'll take one final question. I think maybe over that side of the room, just focus on this side.
Was no question? I saw a hand.
Thank you. I'm curious, in the Museum of the City of New York, were these rooms on exhibit and they just let them get that dirty because they didn't?
I guess the answer is yes. They were on display since the early 40s, I'm guessing. Is that true? That's about 38. Oh, you saw the bulletin. So they've been on continuous display for about 60 years. And I mean, I have to say, it is very difficult to clean a period room because there's so many surfaces. So a responsible cleaning system is of course wise, but it doesn't surprise me at all that for a relatively small museum, these rooms lived on the 5th floor, had very little traffic, so which is probably one of the reasons why they decided in the end to deaccession them. But that's how they survived. Yeah.
Yes, I didn't understand where the third room went.
The third room.
There were 3 rooms?
Correct. So the bedroom and the dressing room went to the Museum in the City of New York. The third room was the smoking room. What they called the smoking room is now called the reception room, in this very heavy Moorish style. And so that has been on display at the Brooklyn Museum since the 40s as well.
And I live in Brooklyn.
And I just heard from one of my colleagues that it's actually closed at the moment. So don't go run and see it. And they actually are also hoping to, it's in quite, even though it's just on display and theirs is actually very nicely closed off, it is still, it deteriorates over time. And they have a big job there as well. Welcome.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Marijn, I'd like to thank you so much on behalf of all associated with the General Society and the audience here tonight for such a fantastic, eloquent and detailed presentation. I think we'll all be rushing December 15th to see artistic furniture of the Gilded Age.
Great.
So thank you
I
so much.
hope I didn't test your patience too much, but
Yeah.
most welcome.
And we have a couple of little mementos that Victoria Dengel would like, our executive director, would like to present to
Looks
you.
official. It's beautiful.
A proclamation. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen expresses its gratitude to you for your contribution to our series and with the subject of the installation and conservation of the Worsham-Rockefeller Dressing Room, and we so thank you for launching this series, for your contribution, and for your visits in between.
Wonderful.
And we are also making you an honorary member of the library,
Oh.
so we see more of you.
That's why I'm here. I was hoping for this. Wonderful.
Thank you so much again.
Look.